How did ancient Romans kill boredom? Let's start with a confession. When we think about ancient Romans, we usually picture something dramatic. Legions marching in perfect formation. Chariots thundering around the Circus Maximus. Gladiators locked in mortal combat. Emperors lounging on golden couches while slaves feed them grapes. And sure, all of that happened. But what about the other hours? The long afternoons when there was no battle to fight, no spectacle to attend, no empire to run. What did an ordinary Roman do when the sun was high? Circumstance's mind started to wander toward that dangerous territory called boredom. The Romans had a word for the life they wanted to avoid: otium. It meant leisure, yes, but not the kind of leisure we might imagine today. Otium was free time, unstructured time, time that could either be filled with meaningful activity or squandered in idleness. And the Romans, practical people that they were, had very strong opinions about how that time ought to be spent. The opposite of otium was negotium, business, work, purposeful activity. Negotium literally meant not leisure. So for the Romans, work was defined as the absence of free time, and free time was defined as the absence of work. This tells you something important about how they thought. They didn't see work and leisure as two separate spheres of life, each with its own value. They saw them at two ends of a spectrum, and the trick was to land somewhere in the middle. Not so busy that life passed you by, not so idle that you wasted away. The philosopher Seneca, who had plenty of time to think about such things during his periods of exile and retirement, wrote extensively about the proper use of leisure. In his essay De Otio on leisure, he argued that the wise person does not simply escape from public duties to lounge around doing nothing. Rather, he retreats into a different kind of activity: study, contemplation, writing, teaching. For Seneca, otium was not the absence of occupation, but the substitution of one kind of occupation for another. The mind, he believed, must always be engaged. Boredom was not merely unpleasant, it was dangerous. An idle mind, like an idle body, would atrophy. Cicero, writing a century earlier, had his own formulation: otium cum dignitate, leisure with dignity. He wasn't talking about napping on a couch. He meant the kind of cultivated leisure that only a person who had already earned his place in the world could properly enjoy. For Cicero, otium was a reward, a privilege reserved for those who had first given their best years to public service. You couldn't just decide to be a man of leisure, you had to earn it. And once you had earned it, you had to use it wisely. Reading, writing, thinking, conversing with other educated people, tending to your land, improving your mind. This wasn't laziness. It was the highest form of living. But what about people who didn't have villas in the countryside and slaves to do their bidding? What about the ordinary Roman, the shopkeeper, the artisan, the soldier, the laborer, the housewife, the child? How did they kill boredom? That's what this exploration is really about. Because for every emperor philosophizing in his garden, there were 1,000 ordinary people trying to figure out what to do with an empty afternoon. And the answers they came up with are fascinating, surprising, and sometimes shocking. This isn't a scholarly treatise. I'm not going to cite every source or qualify every claim. I'm just going to tell you what the Romans did when they were bored. And trust me, they were never bored for long. The daily ritual of the baths. If you wanted to find a Roman during his free time, the first place you'd look would be the baths. Not because Romans were unusually dirty, though they were by modern standards, but because the baths were the social hub of the empire. Every day, around the middle of the afternoon, Romans would finish their work and head to the nearest bathhouse. This wasn't optional. It was as ingrained in daily life as breakfast or dinner. The emperor himself, when asked by a foreigner why he bathed only once a day, replied, "Because I do not have the time to bathe twice a day." Let me describe what this was like. The smallest bathhouses, called balnea, were private establishments that charged a small fee, cheap enough for almost any free Roman to afford. The larger ones, the thermae, were state-owned and often covered several city blocks. The baths of Diocletian in Rome could hold up to 3,000 bathers at once. And these were not just places to get clean. They were sprawling complexes with gymnasiums, libraries, restaurants, gardens, swimming pools, massage rooms, and exercise yards. Think of a modern health club, a spa, a community center, and a shopping mall all rolled into one, and you're getting close. The ritual itself followed a prescribed order. You started in the apoditerium, the dressing room, where you left your clothes with a slave if you had one, or in a small cubicle if you didn't. Then you moved to the palastra, the exercise yard, where you worked up a sweat. The Romans believed that exercise opened the pores and prepared the body for the heat of the baths. You could run, wrestle, lift weights, play ball games, or just stretch and move. Slaves would oil your body, olive oil, usually mixed with perfume or herbs, to help the sweat flow. After exercising, you entered the baths proper. The first stop was the frigidarium, the cold room. This held a cold plunge bath, and the shock of the cold water was supposed to close the pores and tone the body. Some Romans skipped this step, going straight to the warm rooms, but the traditionalists insisted on starting cold. From there, you moved to the tepidarium, the warm room. This was a kind of transition zone, neither too hot nor too cold, where you could linger, chat, and let your body adjust. The tepidarium often had heated floors and walls, with the heat coming from a hypocaust system, furnaces underneath the building that circulated hot air through hollow spaces in the floors and walls. The floors were sometimes so hot that you had to wear wooden sandals to avoid burning your feet. Finally, you reached the caldarium, the hot room. This was the heart of the bathing experience. The caldarium was a steamy, humid room with a hot plunge bath or a labrum, a large basin of water. The temperature could be intense, almost suffocating, but the Romans loved it. They believed that the heat opened the pores, loosened the muscles, and purged the body of impurities. You could sit in the caldarium for as long as you could stand it, sweating profusely, then have a slave scrape the oil and sweat off your skin with a curved metal tool called a strigil. This scraping was not gentle. The strigil was like a dull knife, and the slave would run it over your entire body, removing the mixture of oil, sweat, and dirt in long strokes. It hurt a little, but the Romans considered it the height of cleanliness. After the caldarium, you reverse the order. Warm room, cold room, dressing room, and your bath was complete. The whole process could take an hour or two, but many Romans lingered much longer. The baths were not just about bathing. They were about socializing, gossiping, conducting business, flirting, eating, drinking, reading, gambling, and generally passing the time in pleasant company. The great Roman writer Seneca, who was not always a fan of the baths, he preferred his own quiet villa, described the noise that came from the baths above his apartment. I hear the grunts of the muscle men as they work out with their weights, the sharp crack of a ball hitting a player's arm, the splashing of someone diving into the pool, the shouts of the sausage seller, the pastry cook, and all the vendors of the bathhouse, each hawking his wares. It was chaos, but it was beloved chaos. The baths were also places of surprising equality. Old and young, rich and poor, free and freed, all mixed together. There were separate sections for women in some bathhouses, and in others, men and women bathed together, though this varied by period and local custom. The extremely wealthy had private baths in their villas, but even they often preferred the public baths for the social contact. It was hard to feel superior when you were both sitting naked in a hot pool. And the baths were everywhere. When the Romans conquered a new territory, one of the first buildings they constructed, after the roads and the walls, was a bathhouse. Baths were a symbol of Romanitas, of being Roman. To bathe like a Roman was to be a Roman. The empire spread the bathhouse culture from Britain to North Africa to the Middle East, and in every province, the locals learned to love the daily ritual of hot water, cold water, and strigil scraping. If you were bored in ancient Rome, the baths offered a simple solution. Go get clean. And in the process, you would inevitably find something or someone to occupy your attention. It was the easiest way to kill an afternoon, and millions of Romans did it every single day. The spectacle of spectacles. But the baths were for ordinary days, for special occasions, and there were many special occasions. The Romans turned to something much grander, the spectacles. The phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses, comes from the Roman poet Juvenal, who used it to describe the two things that kept the Roman populace happy and distracted. The Emperor Fronto, writing a few decades later, put it even more bluntly. The Roman people are concerned primarily with two things, food and spectacles. And what spectacles they were. The Romans had a bewildering variety of public entertainments, and they were almost always free. The state paid for the spectacles, and the emperors competed to put on the most magnificent shows. Augustus, who knew a thing or two about public relations, made sure that the spectacles were not only spectacular, but also well organized. Before his reforms, the games had been chaotic, with fights breaking out among the spectators. Augustus imposed order, assigned seating, numbered tickets, ushers to keep the peace. He turned chaos into a system. The most famous spectacles were, of course, the gladiatorial combats. These took place in amphitheaters, the Flavian amphitheater, better known as the Colosseum, being the grandest of them all. The gladiators were usually slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals. But some freemen also volunteered, drawn by the glory, the pay, or the sheer thrill of the arena. They fought in pairs, often with different styles of armor and weapons. The secutor with his heavy shield and short sword, the retiarius with his net and trident, the thriax with his curved sword and small shield. The fights were brutal and often fatal, but the Romans loved them. They cheered for their favorites, placed bets on the outcomes, and analyzed the techniques as if they were watching a sport. The Emperor Claudius, according to Suetonius, was particularly fond of the gladiators. He would sit in his box, leaning forward with excitement, and when a gladiator fell, he would turn to his neighbors and discuss the man's technique, whether he had fought well, whether he deserved to live or die. Claudius was also a fan of the venationes, the wild beast hunts. These involved pitting animals against each other or against human hunters. Lions, tigers, elephants, bears, crocodiles, and hundreds of other exotic creatures were imported from across the empire to be slaughtered in the arena. The sheer scale was staggering. For the dedication of the Colosseum in AD 80, the Emperor Titus allegedly had 9,000 animals killed in a single day. Even more ambitious were the naumachiae, the naval battles. The Romans would flood the arena, or dig a special basin, and stage full-scale sea battles, complete with real warships, thousands of rowers, and hundreds of combatants. Augustus had a basin dug near the Tiber for his naumachia, and he continued to watch the contests even in heavy rain. These spectacles were not just entertainment. They were demonstrations of Roman power, reminders of the empire's ability to conquer not just land, but also the sea. The chariot races at the Circus Maximus were equally popular, if less bloody. The circus was the largest stadium in ancient Rome, holding perhaps 250,000 spectators. The races featured 4 teams: the Reds, the Whites, the Blues, and the Greens, each with its passionate fans. The drivers, often slaves or freedmen, could become celebrities, and the best of them, like Gaius Apuleius Diocles, earned fortunes that rivaled modern sports stars. Diocles won 1,462 races out of 4,257, and his total prize money allegedly came to 35 million sesterces, enough to feed the entire city of Rome for a year. The racing was dangerous. Drivers wrapped the reins around their arms and wrists, which meant that if they crashed, they could be dragged to their deaths. But they took the risk for glory and money, and the crowds loved them for it. The circus was also a place of tremendous social mixing. Senators had their reserved seats, but the common people crowded together in the tiers, shouting, betting, eating, drinking, and occasionally rioting when the wrong team won. Then there was the theater. The ludi scaenicii, the stage games, were originally serious dramas, but over time they devolved into lighter fare, comedies, farces, mimes, and pantomimes. The Roman playwrights Plautus and Terence wrote comedies that are still performed today, plays about clever slaves, foolish old men, and star-crossed lovers. But by the imperial period, the crowd wanted something rawer. They got it. The mimes were often obscene, with actors performing nude or simulating sex acts. The pantomimes were more refined, single dancers who performed entire stories through movement, accompanied by music and chorus. The Emperor Augustus, who was something of a theater connoisseur, would sometimes invite his friends to his private box to watch the pantomimes, discussing the dancer's technique and the quality of the performance. But he also knew what the crowd wanted, and he gave it to them. Under Augustus, the spectacles became more frequent, more varied, and more magnificent than ever before. The sheer number of feast days and festivals in the Roman calendar is almost impossible to believe. One scholar calculated that the obligatory feast days of imperial Rome occupied more than half the year. And that doesn't count the neighborhood festivals, the local shrines, the guild celebrations, the military ceremonies, and the special shows put on by wealthy citizens hoping to win votes. As a result, there was no Roman year that did not bear 2 feast days to a working day. The spectacles were almost daily. So, if you were bored in ancient Rome, you could always check the calendar. Odds were good that somewhere in the city, someone was putting on a show, and you could go for free, sit among your neighbors, eat some bread, and watch someone else take risks that you would never dare to take. The dinner party as an art form. But not all Roman leisure was about watching other people do things. Some of it was about doing things yourself, preferably in the company of friends and with a great deal of excellent food and wine. The dinner party, or convivium, was one of the great Roman institutions. It was not just a meal. It was a performance, a ritual, a display of wealth and taste, and a way to pass an entire evening, sometimes an entire night, in cultivated enjoyment. The Roman dinner party has a bad reputation, thanks in large part to a single satirical work, Petronius's Satyricon, which features a character named Trimalchio, who throws the most ostentatious, vulgar, and hilarious dinner party in all of literature. Trimalchio serves dishes like a wild boar, wearing a freedman's cap, from whose tusks hang little baskets of dates, a hare with wings attached, meant to look like Pegasus, and a gigantic roast pig that, when cut open, releases live thrushes. He entertains his guests with acrobats, singers, and a librarian who recites poetry. He talks constantly about his wealth, his slaves, his wife, his plans for his own tomb. It is a masterpiece of exaggeration, but like all satire, it is grounded in reality. The Romans really did throw elaborate dinner parties. They really did try to outdo each other with exotic foods and extravagant entertainments, and they really did spend hours, sometimes whole days, reclining on couches, eating course after course, and drinking wine until dawn. Let me describe a typical formal dinner. The dining room was called a triclinium, which literally means three-couch room. The couches were arranged in a U-shape around a central table, with each couch holding 3 diners. That made 9 guests, the ideal number for a civilized evening. More guests could be accommodated by adding extra couches, but the Romans believed that conversation required intimacy, and too many people made that impossible. The guests arrived in the late afternoon, removed their sandals, and washed their hands. They reclined on the couches on their left elbows, with their heads pointing toward the table. This posture took some getting used to, but the couches were angled to make it comfortable, and the cushions were thick and soft. The host arranged his guests carefully, placing the most honored guests on the couch to his right, the least honored on the couch to his left. Status was everything. The meal itself consisted of 3 courses: the gustatio appetizers, the mensae primae main course, and the mensae secundae dessert. The appetizers might include eggs, olives, shellfish, salads, and small portions of meat or fish. The main course was the centerpiece: roast meats, whole fish, stuffed animals, elaborate casseroles. The Romans loved strong flavors: garlic, fish sauce, garum, honey, vinegar, herbs, and spices. The cookbook of Apicius, compiled in the late 4th century A.D., includes recipes for such delicacies as lark's tongues, sterile sows' wombs, and milk-fed snails. The famous gourmand Apicius, for whom the cookbook is named, was said to have committed suicide after spending 100 million sesterces on his kitchen and discovering he had only 10 million left. Between courses, diners rinsed their fingers in perfumed water, while slaves washed the table and swept away the bones and shells that had been tossed onto the floor. Each guest brought his own napkin, which he used not only to wipe his hands and mouth, but also to take home leftovers and small gifts from the host. This was not considered gauche. It was expected. After the dessert course, the host would make an offering of something like meat, cake, and wine to the household gods, the Lares. Then the serious drinking began. This was the commissatio, the drinking party, which was the Roman equivalent of the Greek symposium. The wine was mixed with water, Drinking undiluted wine was considered barbaric, and the guests would elect a king of the feast who would decide the rules for the evening, including how many cups each person would drink and in what order. The wine flowed freely, conversation deepened, and the entertainment became more raucous. What kind of entertainment? Music, for one. The Romans had a wide variety of musical instruments, from the tibia, a double reed pipe similar to an oboe, to the cithara, a large lyre, to the hydraulis, a water organ that could produce surprisingly loud and complex sounds. A good dinner party might feature a small ensemble of musicians playing throughout the meal. Poets might recite their latest work. Actors might perform a short mime. Dancers might perform the pantomime, a solo dance that told an entire story through gestures and movements. And, if the guests were particularly sophisticated, there might be philosophical conversation, with the host leading a discussion of virtue, duty, or the nature of the gods. But the most important entertainment was conversation itself. The Romans prized eloquence, wit, and the ability to hold one's own in a debate. A good dinner guest could tell a story, quote a poet, make an argument, or deliver a joke with perfect timing. A bad dinner guest was silent, boring, or, worst of all, drunk and obnoxious. The ideal was to be a comus, a pleasant and affable companion, someone who could mix seriousness with humor, learning with charm. The dinner party was not just about the wealthy. People of all classes held dinner parties, though on a smaller scale. A shopkeeper might invite his friends for a simple meal of bread, cheese, olives, and cheap wine. A soldier might share a meal with his comrades in the barracks. A family might eat together in their small apartment, with children and parents and grandparents all crowded around a single table. The form was the same, reclining on couches, eating in courses, drinking wine, but the scale was adjusted to fit the budget. And the dinner party was, above all, a way to kill time. A good dinner party could last from late afternoon until the early morning hours, and by the end of it, no one would remember that they had ever been bored. The food, the wine, the conversation, the entertainment, all of it conspired to fill the hours with pleasure and meaning. The board games of the Empire. When the Romans weren't at the baths or the spectacles or the dinner parties, they were often playing games. Board games, dice games, gambling games. The Romans loved to play. They played at home, in the baths, in the taverns, in the army camps, on the streets, and even in the public squares. Archaeologists have found game boards scratched into the marble steps of the Colosseum, into the benches of the army barracks, into the pavements of Pompeii. If you had flat surface and a few hours to kill, you could find a Roman somewhere who was willing to play. The most popular board game was Ludus Latrunculorum, the game of robbers or mercenaries. It was a strategy game, something like chess or checkers, in which two players moved pieces around a grid and captured each other's pieces by surrounding them. The board could be any size, anywhere from 6 by 7 to 14 by 14, and the pieces were called latrones robbers or militus soldiers. The goal was to capture all of your opponent's pieces, or to immobilize them so that they could not move. No complete rulebook survives, but scholars have reconstructed the game from references in ancient literature and from the boards that have been found. It was a game of pure skill with no element of chance, and it was deeply loved by the Roman military. Soldiers played it in their free time, honing their tactical thinking in a simulated battlefield. Another popular game was tabula, the ancestor of backgammon. Tabula was played on a board with 24 points, and each player had 15 pieces. 3 dice were thrown, and the numbers determined how far the pieces could move. The goal was to get all of your pieces off the board before your opponent did. Tabula involved both skill and chance, and it was notorious for its gambling potential. The Romans loved to bet on the outcome of a game, and tabula was one of the games primarily responsible for the gambling problem in Rome. A similar game was duodecim scripta 12 lines, which was also a precursor to backgammon. The board had 12 lines, and the pieces were moved along these lines according to the throw of the dice. The main strategy was to stack your pieces on the same cell to keep them safe, while leaving your opponent's single pieces vulnerable to being knocked back to the start. Like tabula, it was a game of luck and strategy, and it was played throughout the empire. The dice themselves were objects of fascination. The Romans had 2 main types of dice: tesserae, which were 6-sided cubes like modern dice, and tali, which were 4-sided knucklebones, usually made from the ankle bones of sheep or goats. The tali were marked on only 4 sides with the 2 ends left blank, and the scoring combinations had poetic Latin names. The highest roll, when all 4 tali showed different sides, was called a Venus, the Venus throw. Gamblers would pray for a Venus, just as modern gamblers pray for a 7. Gambling was officially illegal in Rome, except during the festival of Saturnalia, when the normal rules were suspended and anything went. But the laws were widely ignored, and even emperors were known to be enthusiastic gamblers. The Emperor Claudius, according to Suetonius, was a keen dice player who wrote a book on the subject, and was known to cheat when he thought he could get away with it. Augustus, too, enjoyed gambling, though he was more discreet about it. He would play with his friends and freedmen, betting small sums and laughing when he lost. There were many other games as well. Calculi was a game of Roman checkers, played on a board with 8 by 8 squares. Turni Lapilli was a Roman version of tic-tac-toe, played on a simple 3 by 3 grid. The Romans also played games of pure chance, like Alea, essentially a dice-rolling game in which players bet on the outcome of a single throw. They played odd or even, guessing whether the number of coins in someone's hand was odd or even. They played games with nuts and pebbles, with hoops and sticks, with balls of various sizes. What is striking about all of these games is their universality. Game boards have been found in every corner of the empire, from the rainy outpost of Britain to the desert forts of Syria. They were played by emperors and slaves, by soldiers and civilians, by men and women and children. Game pieces were made of everything from cheap clay and bone to luxurious ivory and glass. If you had nothing else, you could scratch a board into a step and use pebbles as pieces. The Romans were not picky. They just wanted to play, and playing killed boredom. A game of Latrunculi could take an hour or more, and in that hour the players were fully engaged, thinking, strategizing, betting, celebrating, commiserating. Time passed without being noticed. The mind was occupied. The world outside faded away, and when the game was over, you could play another, or find another opponent, or move on to something else. The intellectual pleasures of otium. But not all. Romans killed boredom through physical activity or social entertainment. Some of them, the elite mostly, but also the aspiring middle classes, found their escape in intellectual pursuits: reading, writing, philosophy, poetry, history, rhetoric. These were not just duties or pastimes. They were the very essence of cultivated leisure, of otium as the Romans understood it. The Romans were a literate society, though not everyone could read. Books were expensive, written on papyrus scrolls volumina that were painstakingly copied by hand. But the elite owned substantial libraries, and public libraries existed in Rome as well, stocked with Greek and Latin works. Reading was not a solitary activity, as it tends to be today. The Romans read aloud, even when alone, and they preferred to listen to texts being read by a skilled reader. The sound of the words mattered almost as much as their meaning. The practice of recitatio, public reading, was a major part of literary culture. An author would stand before an audience and read his latest work aloud, sometimes in a private home, sometimes in a theater or bathhouse. The audience would listen, applaud, offer criticism, and engage in discussion afterward. These recitations were social events as much as literary ones. They were opportunities to see and be seen, to connect with patrons and rivals, to gauge the reception of a new work before it was published. The Emperor Augustus was a great patron of the arts, and his advisor Maecenas gathered around him a circle of poets, Virgil, Horace, Propertius, whose works became the classics of Latin literature. Horace, in particular, wrote beautifully about the pleasures of otium. In his Odes, he describes his Sabine farm, a modest estate given to him by Maecenas, where he could retreat from the pressures of the city and devote himself to study, writing, and simple pleasures. Good wine, fresh water, the company of friends, the beauty of the countryside. Virgil, the poet of the Aeneid, was more intense, more driven, but he too understood the value of leisure properly used. He spent years working on his epic poem, revising and polishing, treating his otium as a form of labor, even, as he called it, leisure. The writer, for Virgil, was not someone who escaped from work into idleness. He was someone who substituted one kind of work for another, quieter, more solitary, but no less demanding. The philosopher Seneca, who wrote so much about otium, practiced what he preached. In his moral letters to Lucilius, he offers advice on how to live a good life, and much of that advice concerns the proper use of free time. Read, Seneca says, think, write. Talk to your friends about important matters. Contemplate the nature of the gods, the purpose of the universe, the meaning of virtue. Do not waste your leisure on trivial entertainments that leave you feeling emptier than before. Use it to improve yourself, to become more virtuous, more wise, more fully human. But Seneca was also realistic. He knew that the most people did not want to spend their free time reading philosophy. He knew that the baths and the spectacles and the dinner parties were more appealing, and he did not condemn them exactly. He simply warned against excess. The problem was not entertainment itself, but the constant demand for more entertainment, more novelty, more distraction. The Romans, Seneca feared, were becoming a nation of people who could not bear to be alone with their own thoughts. They filled every moment with noise and activity, and in doing so, they lost the ability to be still, to reflect, to know themselves. Cicero, who lived a century before Seneca, had a slightly different view. For Cicero, otium was not an escape from public life, but a supplement to it. A man who had served the state well could retire to his villa and devote himself to writing, confident that his works would benefit future generations. Cicero's own philosophical dialogues, works like On the Orator, On the Republic, On the Laws, were written during periods of enforced retirement, when political circumstances kept him away from the forum. These were not idle works. They were the product of immense labor and learning, and they were intended to teach, to inspire, to shape the minds of Roman youth. Cicero's concept of otium cum dignitate, leisure with dignity, captured something essential about the Roman attitude. Leisure was not a right, it was a privilege, and it came with responsibilities. The person who had the good fortune to enjoy free time was expected to use that time well, to read widely, to think deeply, to converse wisely, to write clearly, to leave something behind that would benefit others. This ideal was not confined to the very wealthy. In the Roman educational system, boys and some girls learned to read and write from an early age. They memorized passages from the poets. They practiced speaking and debating. They studied philosophy, or at least the basics of Stoicism and Epicureanism. Even a modest household might own a few scrolls, a copy of Homer, some of Cicero's speeches, a collection of Horace's odes, and in the quiet evenings, after the work was done and the children were in bed, the family might gather to listen to a reading, to discuss what they had heard, to pass the time in cultivated conversation. Of course, not everyone embraced the intellectual ideal. Most Romans, like most people in any society, preferred easier forms of amusement. They went to the baths, the games, the dinner parties. They gambled, drank, gossiped, flirted, and slept. But the intellectual tradition was always there, a counterweight to the excesses of popular entertainment. And for those who were genuinely bored, not with nothing to do, but with the emptiness of the things they were doing, the books offered a way out: music, dance, and performance. If reading seemed too much like work, there was always music. The Romans loved music, though we know less about it than we might like. Instruments have survived, and images of musicians appear in paintings and mosaics, but the actual sound of Roman music is mostly lost to us. What we can say is that music was everywhere. At the baths, the dinner parties, the religious ceremonies, the military parades, the theatrical performances. It accompanied almost every social activity, providing rhythm, mood, and meaning. The most common Roman instrument was the tibia, a double reed pipe similar to the Greek aulos. It was played with two pipes, one in each hand, producing a sound that was reedy, piercing, and surprisingly versatile. The tibia could be mournful or joyful, subtle or bombastic, depending on how it was played. It was the instrument of choice for religious ceremonies, theatrical performances, and private entertainments. The cithara was a larger, more formal string instrument, a kind of lyre with a wooden sound box that amplified the sound. It was played by professional musicians at public events, and it was considered a more refined instrument than the tibia. The Emperor Nero, famously, loved to perform on the kithara, even appearing on public stages despite the scandal this caused among the elite. The hydraulis was the Roman equivalent of a pipe organ, powered by water pressure. It was loud enough to be heard over the noise of a crowd or the roar of an arena, and it was used in the spectacles, the chariot races, the gladiatorial games. The hydraulis produced a continuous sound, unlike the tibia or kithara, which had to be constantly re-energized. It was the most technologically sophisticated instrument of the ancient world, and it was a source of wonder to everyone who heard it. Music was not just something you listened to, it was something you participated in, if you had the skill. Many Romans learned to play an instrument, just as many Romans learned to read. The dinner party, in particular, was a setting for musical performance. A guest might take up the tibia and play a tune, or a host might hire a professional musician to entertain the company. Slaves and freedmen were often trained as musicians, and a wealthy household might have its own ensemble for private performances. Dance was also popular, though it carried some social stigma. Respectable Romans danced, but not too much, and not in public. The pantomime, however, was another matter entirely. The pantomime was a solo dance that told a story, often drawn from mythology, using only gestures and movements. The dancer wore a mask and a costume, and he was accompanied by a chorus and a small ensemble of musicians. The audience watched intently, trying to follow the story, and they applauded or hissed depending on the dancer's skill. The pantomime was wildly popular in the imperial period. Some pantomimes became celebrities, with fans who followed them from theater to theater and rioted when their favorites were booed. The Emperor Augustus was a fan of the pantomime, and he occasionally invited pantomimes to perform in his private box. Tiberius, his successor, was less enthusiastic, and he tried to restrict the pantomime's influence, but he had little success. The people loved their dancers, and the dancers loved the attention. The mime was the pantomime's cruder cousin. The mime featured spoken dialogue, usually in Latin, and it was often obscene, violent, or politically subversive. Mime actors performed without masks, and women appeared on stage in the mime, something that did not happen in the more respectable forms of theater. The mime was the entertainment of the common people, performed in small theaters and taverns, and it was famous for its low humor and its willingness to mock authority. Theatrical performances, including both pantomime and mime, were part of the Ludi Scienici, the stage games that were held in honor of the gods. The theaters of Rome, the theater of Pompey, the theater of Marcellus were magnificent buildings, seating thousands of spectators, and the performances were free to all citizens. The plays themselves were often adapted from Greek originals, but the Romans added their own flavor, more slapstick, more violence, more sexual innuendo. The plays of Plautus and Terence, the great Roman comedians, survive to this day. They are funny, clever, and surprisingly modern in their concerns. Young lovers struggling against their parents, clever slaves outwitting their masters, greedy pimps and foolish old men getting their comeuppance. The Romans laughed at these plays just as we laugh at sitcoms, and they watched them again and again, finding comfort in familiar jokes and beloved characters. Music, dance, and theater were not just entertainment. They were forms of social bonding, ways of marking time, methods of escaping the ordinary. A night at the theater, a concert in the baths, a pantomime in the forum. These were the things that made Roman life feel rich and full. They were the antidotes to boredom, the spices that flavored the daily bread, the social clubs and associations. Not all Roman leisure was organized by the state or the wealthy. Ordinary Romans formed their own clubs, associations, and social groups, and these collegia were a vital part of daily life. A collegium was basically any group of people who came together for a common purpose: religious worship, social drinking, mutual aid, or just friendship. The collegia had formal structures: presidents, treasurers, secretaries, and regular meetings. They collected dues from their members, which were used to fund banquets, festivals, and the burial expenses of members who died. In a society without social welfare, the collegia provided a crucial safety net. If you belonged to a collegium, you knew that when you died, your fellow members would see to it that you received a proper burial. something that was considered essential for the peace of your soul. But the collegia were about more than insurance. They were about community. The members dined together on the birthdays of benefactors, on religious holidays, and on any other occasion that seemed to call for celebration. They held processions through the streets, wearing their distinctive robes and carrying their symbols. They competed with other collegia in games and festivals. They gossiped, gambled, drank, and made plans. The collegia were particularly important for freedmen, former slaves who had won their freedom, but lacked the family connections and social standing of freeborn Romans. In a collegium, a freedman could be a president, could lead the meetings, could command respect. It was a way of building a new identity, of creating a new family out of the bonds of friendship and mutual obligation. The Roman authorities viewed the collegia with some suspicion. These clubs had a tendency to become politically active, to agitate for better treatment, to challenge the established order. The Emperor Trajan, in a famous exchange with Pliny the Younger, expressed his concern about the collegia in the province of Bithynia. Pliny had asked whether he should allow the formation of a new fire brigade, and Trajan replied that he was worried such a group would turn into a political faction. Better to let things burn than to give the people an excuse to organize. Despite the official suspicion, the collegia flourished. They were too useful, too beloved, too deeply embedded in the social fabric to be suppressed. And they were a perfect way to kill boredom. If you had nothing to do on a given evening, you could always go to a collegium meeting, share a meal with your friends, listen to a speech or a poem, play a few rounds of dice, and go home feeling that the time had been well spent. The countryside and the villa, for those who could afford it, the ultimate escape from boredom was the countryside. The Romans were not a rustic people, not really. They were city dwellers, proud of their urban civilization, but they also understood that the city could become oppressive. The noise, the crowds, the smell, the constant pressure of social obligation. The remedy was the villa, a country house where a Roman could enjoy otium in its purest form. Quiet, solitude, nature, and the simple pleasures of rural life. The villa was not just a house, it was an estate, often consisting of several buildings, gardens, orchards, vineyards, and farmlands. Some villas were working farms, producing wine, oil, grain, and other products for market. Others were purely for pleasure, designed for relaxation and entertainment, rather than agriculture. The Villa Urbana was a luxury retreat, the place where a wealthy Roman could spend the summer months, escaping the heat and the malaria of the city. The villa was a setting for otium in the fullest sense. You could read, write, think, and converse without interruption. You could walk through the gardens, listening to the birds and the wind. You could swim in the pool, bathe in the private bathhouse, exercise in the private gymnasium. You could hunt or fish or ride or just sit and stare at the landscape. You could invite your friends for a quiet dinner without the formality and competition of a city banquet. You could do nothing at all if you wanted, and no one would judge you for it. The Roman writers describe the villa in idyllic terms. Pliny the Younger, whose letters give us many glimpses of his life in the country, owned several villas near Rome and on the Bay of Naples. He describes one of them in loving detail: the portico that caught the sun, the bedroom that faced the sea, the dining room with its view of the mountains, the garden with its fountains and topiary. He tells us how he spent his days at the villa, sleeping late, reading in the morning, exercising at noon, bathing in the afternoon, dining in the evening, and then talking with his friends until late into the night. It sounds like paradise. and for Pliny, it probably was. But the villa was not only for the ultra-wealthy. There were modest villas as well, small farms with a comfortable house attached. A successful craftsman or merchant might buy a small piece of land outside the city, build a house, and spend his weekends and holidays there. The villa was an ideal, a dream of a better life, and many Romans aspired to it, even if they never achieved it. The countryside was also the setting for hunting and fishing, activities that the Romans enjoyed both for sport and for food. Hunting was a particular passion of the Roman elite, who saw it as a manly pursuit that honed the skills of war. They hunted boar, deer, hare, and other game, using dogs, nets, and spears. Fishing was more peaceful, but no less popular. The Romans loved fresh fish, and they stocked their private ponds with exotic species, both for eating and for viewing. The villa was also a place for gardening. The hortus, the kitchen garden, provided vegetables, fruit, and herbs for the household, and it was a source of quiet satisfaction for the owner. The horti, the large pleasure gardens, were works of art, designed by landscape architects and filled with statues, fountains, and shaded walkways. The gardens of Sallust, the gardens of Maecenas, the gardens of Lucullus. These were not just gardens. They were entire parks, open to the public in some cases, and they were among the most beautiful spaces in the Roman world. The villa was the Roman answer to the problem of too much civilization. When the city became unbearable, when the crowds and the noise and the endless demands of social life threatened to overwhelm you, you could retreat to the villa and find peace. And peace, the Romans believed, was the ultimate antidote to boredom. Not the peace of nothingness, but the peace of purpose, the quiet purpose of reading, writing, thinking, growing, and simply being alive in a beautiful place. Children and their games. The Romans were not sentimental about childhood. They did not see children as innocent or precious. They saw them as small, imperfect adults in need of discipline and education. But even the sternest Roman parent recognized that children needed to play, and play they did, with a variety of toys and games that would be familiar to any modern child. Roman children had dolls, rag dolls, wooden dolls, clay dolls, ivory dolls for the wealthy. The dolls had movable limbs and hair that could be styled, and girls would dress them in tiny clothes and put them to bed in tiny beds. Boys had wooden swords and toy soldiers, which they used to reenact battles and practice for their future careers. Both sexes had hoops, which they rolled along the ground with a stick, racing each other to see who could go farthest without losing control. They had tops, yo-yos, balls, stilts, hobby horses, and kites. Knucklebones, the tali, were not just for gambling. Children played with them as well, tossing them into the air and trying to catch them on the back of the hand, or throwing them against a wall and trying to land them in specific patterns. This was the ancient version of jacks, and it was popular with both boys and girls. The Romans also played ball games, though we don't know the exact rules. There was a game called harpastum, which involved two teams trying to keep a ball away from each other. It was fast, rough, and probably something like modern rugby or soccer. The Emperor Augustus loved to watch ball games, and he often organized matches between Italians and Greeks in the gymnasiums of the baths. Outdoor games included hide-and-seek, tag, and a version of kick the can. Children also played with marbles, though Roman marbles were made of clay or stone rather than glass. They built miniature chariots and raced them. They played war games, building fortifications out of sticks and stones, and then storming them with their toy soldiers. Board games were not just for adults. Children played simpler versions of La Truncoli and Tabula, or they played games specifically designed for young minds. One such game was Ludus Morellus, the mill game, which was played on a board with 3 concentric squares connected by lines. The goal was to get 3 pieces in a row, and it was simple enough for even young children to understand. Roman children also played at being adults. They held pretend banquets, complete with miniature couches and tiny plates. They played house, with dolls standing in for family members. They played school, pretending to be the teacher or the student. They imitated the rituals they saw around them, the religious ceremonies, the political speeches, the legal trials, absorbing the values and practices of Roman society through play. Childhood was short in ancient Rome. Girls were often married by the age of 12 or 13. Boys were expected to take on adult responsibilities by their mid-teens. But for those few years of relative freedom, children played with an intensity and joy that would be recognizable to any parent. And when they were bored, and children, then as now, got bored easily, they found ways to fill the hours. They invented games, made up stories, explored their neighborhoods, got into trouble. The boredom of a Roman child was no different from the boredom of a modern child. It was a call to creativity, an invitation to play. The dark side of Roman leisure. We cannot talk about how Romans killed boredom without acknowledging the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of their entertainments. Not all of the spectacles were bloodless. Not all of the games were innocent. And the Romans themselves were not always comfortable with what they had created. The gladiatorial combats are the most obvious example. We have romanticized them, turned them into stories of heroism and sacrifice. But the reality was horrific. Men, and sometimes women, were forced to fight to the death for the amusement of others. The crowds cheered when blood was spilled. They booed when a fighter showed fear. They demanded death, and they got it. The Emperor Augustus, who presided over countless games, once had 1,000 gladiators fight in a single day. The arena floor was so soaked with blood that sand had to be brought in to absorb it. The venationes, the beast hunts, were no better. Elephants, lions, tigers, bears, and countless other creatures were brought from the far reaches of the empire to be slaughtered in the arena. Some were killed by hunters, some by gladiators, some by other animals. The Romans had no concept of animal rights, no sense that an elephant might suffer or a lion might feel fear. The animals were resources, objects, spectacles. Their deaths were entertainment. The naumachiae, the naval battles, were mass killings disguised as sport. Thousands of men, prisoners of war, condemned criminals, slaves, were put on ships and forced to fight to the death. The water turned red with blood. The bodies floated to the surface and were dragged away. The crowds applauded. And what of the spectators themselves? What did it do to a person to watch such things? Seneca, who was not a man given to easy moralizing, wrote a letter about the gladiatorial games in which he expressed his revulsion. He had been to the games, he said, and he had been disappointed, not because they were too violent, but because they were not violent enough. The earlier games had been about skill and courage. The games he saw were about slaughter. Men were killed in the morning, he wrote, and then in the afternoon more men were killed, and then more. There was no art to it, no drama, just blood. Seneca's letter is an important document. It shows that even the Romans, who built their leisure around violence, were capable of moral reflection. Not all of them approved of the games. Not all of them found the bloodshed entertaining. Some of them turned away, disgusted, but most did not. Most kept watching. Most kept cheering. The philosopher Epictetus, a former slave, had a different critique. He argued that the spectacles were a form of slavery. The person who cannot live without the games, he said, is not free. They have given away their autonomy to the emperor, to the mob, to the thrill of the arena. They have become prisoners of their own desires, unable to sit still, unable to think, unable to find meaning in their own lives. The games are not a solution to boredom, Epictetus said. They are a symptom of it. They are what you turn to when you have lost the ability to fill your own time with worthwhile activities. This is the paradox of Roman leisure. The Romans were masters of the spectacle, creators of the grandest entertainments the world had ever seen. They could keep themselves busy for days, weeks, months, with a seemingly endless supply of games, shows, and festivals. But at what cost? What was lost when the spectacle became the only way to kill boredom? What was sacrificed to the demand for more excitement, more novelty, more blood? The Romans themselves were not sure. Some celebrated the spectacles as the glory of their civilization. Others lamented them as the downfall of their virtue. Juvenal, the satirist who gave us bread and circuses, mourned the loss of the old Roman spirit, the seriousness, the discipline, the willingness to sacrifice for the common good. The people who had once conquered the world, he said, now wanted only to be fed and entertained. They had become spectators of their own decline. That may be too harsh. The Romans were not a society of passive consumers. They were active participants in their own leisure, whether at the baths, the dinner parties, the game boards, or the villas. They found meaning in their entertainments, not just escape. They built communities around their games, their clubs, their religious festivals. They laughed, wept, argued, loved, and learned in the spaces they created for free time. But the darkness was there, and it is important to acknowledge it. The Romans killed boredom with violence as well as with art, with cruelty as well as with kindness, with death as well as with life. That is part of their legacy, and we do them no favor by pretending otherwise. The philosophy of leisure. The Romans were not just doers, they were thinkers, and they thought a great deal about the problem of boredom, what caused it, what cured it, and what it meant for the human condition. The philosophers, in particular, had much to say on the subject. The Stoics, led by Seneca, argued that boredom was a failure of the mind. The virtuous person, the wise person, the person who lives in accordance with nature and reason, such a person is never bored, because they find meaning in every moment. Even solitude, even inactivity can be filled with contemplation, study, and the pursuit of virtue. The problem is not that there is nothing to do. The problem is that we have lost the ability to see what there is to do. Seneca's essay on the shortness of life is a masterpiece on this theme. He argues that life is not too short. It only seems short because we waste so much of it. We waste our time on trivial pursuits, on meaningless entertainments, on the endless distraction of the spectacles. We fill our days with noise and activity, and then we complain that there are not enough days. But if we used our time wisely, Seneca says, we would have more than enough. We would have eternity itself, because the mind can range over all of human history, all of philosophy, all of the natural world. The person who reads and thinks and learns does not need to worry about boredom. They have an infinite resource of interest and wonder at their disposal. The Epicureans, who rivaled the Stoics in popularity, had a different answer. They argued that the highest good was pleasure, but by pleasure they meant not the gross pleasures of the flesh, though those were acceptable in moderation, but the more refined pleasures of the mind, friendship, contemplation, the simple enjoyment of existence. The Epicureans were not hedonists in the modern sense. They were ascetics who believed that the best life was the simplest life, free from desire, free from fear, free from the endless striving that leads to exhaustion and despair. For the Epicurean, boredom was the result of unfulfilled desire. You are bored because you want something you do not have, and you cannot stop wanting it. The solution is not to get more things. The solution is to want less, to be content with what you have, to find pleasure in the small things, a cup of wine, a piece of bread, a conversation with a friend, and to let go of the restless craving that drives you to seek constant distraction. The Epicurean sage does not need the spectacles. He does not need the games. He needs only a garden, a few friends, and the freedom to think. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who wrote his Meditations in the midst of his campaigns against the barbarians, offers a more austere version of this philosophy. For Marcus, boredom was a form of weakness. The mind that can find no interest in the world is a mind that has not learned to see. Every moment, he says, is an opportunity for virtue. Every encounter, every task, every frustration, all of them can be used to cultivate patience, courage, justice, and wisdom. There is no such thing as an empty moment, because every moment is filled with the potential for moral growth. You are bored, then you are not paying attention. This is hard advice, and most Romans did not take it. They continued to flock to the spectacles, to gamble in the taverns, to gossip in the baths. They continued to seek distraction from the anxieties of existence, to fill the hours with noise and activity. But the philosophical tradition was there, a quiet voice in the background, reminding them that there was another way, not an easier way, perhaps, but a better one. Not a way that killed boredom, but a way that made boredom impossible. The legacy of Roman leisure. So, how did the ancient Romans kill boredom? They killed it in 100 different ways, from the sublime to the ridiculous, from the intellectual to the brutal. They bathed and dined and played and gambled and watched and listened and read and wrote and talked and thought. They built magnificent buildings for their leisure, theaters, amphitheaters, circuses, bathhouses, villas, and they filled those buildings with the sounds of music, the cheers of the crowd, the clatter of dice, the splashing of water. They created a civilization of leisure, perhaps the first civilization in human history, to make free time a central concern. And they left behind a legacy. The modern world is the heir of Rome, whether we like it or not. Our sports stadiums, our swimming pools, our restaurants, our game rooms, our theaters, our concert halls, all of them have their roots in Roman architecture and Roman culture. Our concept of leisure as something distinct from work, as something valuable and worthy of investment, as something that should be available to all citizens, not just the wealthy. That, too, is Roman. The Romans may not have invented leisure, but they invented the idea of leisure as a public good, a social institution, a marker of civilization. But there is a darker legacy as well. The Romans also invented the spectacle as a form of social control, the use of entertainment to distract and pacify the masses. They understood that a well-fed and well-entertained population was less likely to rebel, less likely to question authority, less likely to demand real change. Bread and circuses was not just a cynical observation. It was a policy, and it worked. The Roman Empire lasted for centuries, in part because the emperors kept the people happy with free food and free shows. We see the same dynamic in modern society, of course. Our own spectacles, the movies, the television shows, the sports events, the video games, serve a similar function. They keep us occupied, entertained, and distracted. They fill our free time with content, with stories, with competition, with emotion. They prevent us from asking the hard questions, the ones that might lead to discontent. They are our bread and circuses, and we love them as much as the Romans loved theirs. But the philosophers were right, I think. There is a difference between killing boredom and living well. The person who fills every moment with distraction is not a person who has solved the problem of boredom. They have merely postponed it, buried it beneath layers of noise and activity. And when the noise stops, when the activity ceases, the boredom returns, more powerful than before. The Romans knew this. Seneca knew it. Marcus Aurelius knew it. They knew that the only true cure for boredom was a life of meaning, a life devoted to something larger than oneself, something worth doing, something that could sustain the mind even in the quietest moments. The Romans found that meaning in different ways, in service to the state, in the pursuit of virtue, in the cultivation of the mind, in the love of family and friends. They did not always succeed. They were human, after all, as prone to distraction and triviality as anyone. But they tried, and in their trying, they gave us a model of what leisure could be at its best, when it is not just a way of killing time, but a way of making time come alive. Perhaps that is the lesson of the Romans. Boredom is not a problem to be solved. It is a signal, a warning, a call to attention. When you are bored, you are not living fully. You're not engaged with the world. You're not using your mind or your body in the way they were meant to be used. The solution is not more distraction. It is more presence, more engagement, more meaning. The Romans understood this, at least in their better moments. And they left us the tools to understand it as well. The baths, the books, the games, the dinner parties, the clubs, the villas. All of these were attempts to fill the hours with something worthwhile, not always successful, not always admirable, but always an attempt, always a reaching towards something better. So the next time you find yourself bored, scrolling through your phone, flipping through the channels, searching for something, anything to occupy your attention, think of the Romans. Think of them in the baths, laughing with their friends. Think of them at the dinner table, debating philosophy. Think of them in the garden, reading poetry. Think of them at the arena, cheering for their heroes. They knew something about boredom that we have forgotten. They knew that boredom is not a fact of life. It is a choice, and the choice is always yours.